Okay, perfect. So yeah, for folks who don't know, yeah, my name is Luke Wanek. I'm agroforestry specialist here with Oz, and I'm going to be presenting first here, talking about the workbook, and I'm going to be talking then about goods and services of riparian areas, so different products of value that come out of them, and then turning over to Noreen for the end part to talk about riparian health a bit more. But yeah, starting here by introducing kind of what we're using as the guiding framework for this course, which is available from the Riparian Management course webpage there. Easy, possible to download from there. And this workbook basically has the planning process we are using throughout the course, yeah, to develop the management plans. And it's called backcasting. This framework or process. And what it is, basically, in a nutshell, backcasting is kind of the opposite of forecasting. Forecasting is extrapolating from the current trends or the present into the future. And backcasting is starting from the future and then working your way backwards to the present, or then thinking about the present, to figure, and then sort of figuring out as you work your way backwards what you need to get to that future state. What do you need to do to get to that future state? And the reason I wanted to experiment with backcasting in this course is I feel like it opens you up to be a bit more creative. You're not just extrapolating. You're not just stuck in the present trends. You're thinking to the future, starting with a future vision, and then, okay, how do we make that possible, sort of thing. I think just ordering it in that way is just a subtle way to sort of get you out of current system thinking that you're in, and try to start by thinking about where you want to get to in the long term. So 5 steps of it are defining your parameters, visioning your future state, analyzing your current situation, brainstorming strategies. So yeah, from visioning is your future state, analyzing where you're at currently, brainstorming strategies, all the different ways that you could get from your current state to your future vision, and then prioritizing and ordering strategies. So then you kind of consolidate and prioritize your different strategies into a plan. And so right at the beginning, we're going to start with step 1 is defining your parameters. And I've taken a screenshot of page 5 of the workbook, and in this basically it's what are we focusing on for this plan? What are we looking at? We're not looking at the whole world. We're looking at, in this case, it's about riparian areas, and for you, a particular riparian area, potentially. And so, yeah, based on, this is kind of drawing on what hopefully you had a chance to do last class, or after last class, which is draw out your area, your riparian area, define it on Google Earth Pro. Now, just what we're doing here is just making note of that, writing a title for your area of interest, whichever riparian area you're focusing on, descriptive title, so you remember what it is. And then the other step here is to define your visioning date. Define what year in the future you want to vision to. So whether you're thinking you want to think 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, whatever it might be, because that'll influence, yeah, what's possible, what kind of strategy maybe you need to do to get yourself to where you want to be. So feel free to take maybe a minute to write that down. And if you don't have your book open, or if it's awkward to open it right now, you can also just jot this on a piece of paper or something like that. And then we can you can always fill it in afterwards. So I'm just going to give you, yeah, maybe 30 seconds or so just to write this in here. And if anybody does have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. We can always take that part out of the presentation. I think when I'm doing my actual presentation, I'll just ask that questions stay till the end, because we will be recording these presentations. But for these kind of activity sections, if people have questions, feel free to unmute yourself. Okay, I'm gonna just carry on ahead here. And yeah, hopefully you had a chance to sort of think this through a bit. I know these are big questions, especially the visioning one, so or your date, but you can always change it. So step 2 is now visioning. So we're going to develop our vision for where we want our riparian area to be, and that's what my presentation now is all about. My presentation, yeah, goods and services of riparian area. It's meant to be an ideas presentation, really. So just throwing out ideas about what is possible with riparian areas. These lands that are, as Noreen said last class, 2 to 5 times as productive, and sometimes up to 10 times as productive as your surrounding land base. Well, what can they produce that's a value to us, that's relevant to our context, or to your specific context? And so, yeah, just to get into definition, goods and services, things that we recognize to be of value, called benefits, values, products, gifts, offerings. You might have many different names for this. And the key thing here is, yeah, recognition of value. There's ecosystems provide, they're incredibly, or they can be incredibly productive, but we only really classify it as a good as our service if we recognize it as something we can, quote unquote, use. And I think the picture here of cattails is case in point here, of cattails, such a useful plant, but in our current sort of regular farming agricultural society, we don't think about using cattail for perhaps as many different things as it could be used for, although that's beginning to change. So my goal for this presentation is to try to increase recognition for some of the under-recognized goods and services around riparian areas here. And so, as Noreen, I've taken this figure here from Cows and Fish. And I probably should have put credit at the bottom there, but this is from the User's Guide to Health booklet. As Noreen mentioned last class, the goods and services flow out of having a healthy riparian area. And I think the metaphor of the tap is good, where having a healthy riparian area is like the gears or the mechanical system behind the tap. And once you got that in place, once you got all those functions, those key functions of riparian areas that Noreen was talking about, up and running and working smoothly together, then things start to flow out, and they start to flow out sustainably. So you know that you can have those in the long term. And so that's why we're going to emphasize right after this, Noreen is going to re-emphasize thinking about assessing the health of your riparian area and bringing that up to where it could be, where it needs to be, ideally, and as kind of a supportive base for getting all these different valuable things out of it. But then, of course, the question is, once we start to do that, well, there is a lot of different things that you can do with a riparian area. There's a lot of different possibilities, and it's easy to run under all of this overflowing tap and try to catch it all. But the other kind of part of this presentation is to figure out like what is appropriate for your context. So you're not running back and forth and trying to catch all the water that comes. Although there's nothing wrong with trying to do more, and riparian areas will provide an excess of goods and services. But I think the point here is to figure out what to focus on in your particular context. So the next activity I'd just like you to take a little bit more time to do is if you go to page 7 of your workbook, and if you don't have your workbook open, you can just make this table yourself. Table 1 here. On the left column, list at least 3 activities that you are currently doing or hoping to do in or around your riparian area. So as an example, in this table, I've got calving, and I've actually specified the location. Calving in the pasture to the south of the creek. Market garden to the east of the wetland. Saskatoon harvesting along upper West Bank. Bird watching at the wetlands. So whether these are economic activities or whether these are sort of leisure, hobby activities, start by listing those activities out. That's the first thing, at least 3. And then we're going to do a bit of a needs yields listing. This is taken sort of from permaculture. It's a technique where you list all of the things that those different activities need, and the different things that they yield, or the different products that they produce. So for example, calving in pasture south of creek, we need water, minerals, forage, shelter, human access, fencing, and And it yields calves, manure, grazing, trampling. And it happens maybe in April to May, depending on when you do your calving or whatever, in this case. So, and in this case, I'm implying this calving is not even happening in maybe in a riparian area here, and I probably would advocate it shouldn't for the most part. It's happening even just upland of the riparian area, and I'm including that in because it's nearby. So yeah, feel free to start listing activities that are relevant to your context and their needs and yields and when they're happening in the year. I'm going to give you guys a few minutes just to do that. And I might actually just go back to, well, let's make sure I can see you guys too here. So please feel free to ask if you have any questions. And I should mention, these activities can be activities that you are currently doing or ones that you want to maybe do in the future.
And maybe just a suggestion for those of you, because many of you have your videos off and audios off, which is great while Luke is talking. But maybe once you have a few of those things filled in and you're ready, just put your reaction sign at the bottom, which just shows a thumbs up. That way we know you've had a chance to achieve some of that, as well as, of course, ask questions if you are ready to.
Cool. Super, thanks, Brianna. Super. Yes, I added in reactions this time. It wasn't there last time, but hopefully you guys can all access it. Nice. Cool. Thanks, Judy. Yeah, some of my activities I listed. Yeah, Saskatoon harvesting along Upper West Bank, Saskatoon's water, nutrients, pollination, pest suppression, protection from flooding, shelter, frost drainage. All those are all things that you need to grow Saskatoons, among other things too. But and I'm not saying you have to be so comprehensive, but maybe my presentation will also sort of help you with those needs as well. But yeah. Okay. Give another minute. And then and Noreen, you're just watching to see if anybody comes in too, because I can't see it from this view. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna just continue on here. Hopefully you guys had a chance to, did you have anybody have any questions after that first? Okay, cool. I'm going to continue on, and yeah, and then we'll see how this goes. So yeah, we're using that as a base, keeping that in mind, those activities that you're hoping to do or you're currently doing, kind of use that as a filter, because I'm going to just spew a bunch of ideas at you, and yeah, ignore the ones that don't apply. But there may be some, yeah, that hopefully that do. So yeah, this is all my ideas for what sort of riparian area you might want to have. So, or ideas for goods and services, I should say. So the first few I'm going to talk about have kind of been also talked about by Noreen last class. So a key good service that riparian areas provide is cleaning up our water. So woody species, really effective, particularly at slowing down, but also at sucking up nutrients and contaminants and things like that. They have a bulk to them, and our spring melt, it comes when everything is frozen. They stand up to that and slow it down better than if you just had herbaceous species, particularly on steeper slopes. Herbaceous species, though, are really important. They also slow things down. They also suck them up really well. Those suck up those nutrients. And let's not forget about the soil bacteria that are underneath the water. They're breaking down and sedimenting different nutrients and contaminants. And actually, it's interesting because there's been studies to show that that's one of the reasons that having lots of small wetlands is really important, because you get shallower wetlands, more surface area of the water is in contact with the soil, or the ground surface underneath it, and it just allows for things to be taken up more effectively than if you had one giant deep lake or pond. So clean water is one really a good one. Flood and drought mitigation is something we also talked about last class. This is a neat image from Cows and Fish again about basically where water goes in the wetland. It flows into the wetland and then it can be infiltrated into the ground or the aquifers, into the shallow groundwater, and it goes up into adjacent uplands, or it can be evaporated. And apparently, I find this really interesting. A study in Saskatchewan showed that actually 75% of the water that they studied stayed infiltrated into the adjacent uplands. So it didn't go to the ground. Actually, very little happened to go into the aquifer, at least in this study. A lot of it kind of went uphill, and it was sort of through the kind of the soil capillary action, it's called, where it follows the gradients, and it's where plants are sucking it up, and it's basically providing moisture for your crops and or trees or things like that are growing there. 75% went there, about 25% was evaporated. Reduced erosion and slumping. So a really a thing that effective riparian areas can do is to start to hold the banks together and protect water quality in that way as well. Deep binding root mass that Noreen talked about as rebar last class. This is just a little project we did or a large project we did in Grand Prairie, and it's just in a single season, so it's still very young. But we did some willow staking. So you can see the stakes kind of at the bottom there, into a channel that had been really incised. It had been cleared away and cropped for decades. And we were trying to establish the banks back a bit. And so you can see in September, those willows are starting to grow, and they're going to sort of hopefully start to hold that bank so less and less of it gets scoured and incised deeper and deeper. So this is an early process, but that's just an example of another service that riparian areas can provide. Again, Noreen talked about biodiversity habitat, and she mentioned that 80% of Alberta's wildlife depend on riparian areas for all or part of their life cycle. And yeah, it's this incredible productivity. You got water nearby, you got a lot of structural diversity, so different heights and shapes and sizes of different plants around means that there's a lot of different niches for different things to fill. So they're great for that. And then we can get a bit more specific. So goods and services that might be relevant for different contexts. So one of the things that Oz has been talking about a lot recently is habitat for things like pollinators and also pest suppressing insects. So there's ways to certain riparian areas, and this where design starts to come in too, can be really great havens for wild pollinators. And you might be interested in that if you're wanting to increase pollination services to a surrounding crop, or pest suppression as well. Or you might be just interested in it because you really care and are excited about wild pollinators. So I just want to highlight that you can sort of customize your riparian area and start to really think about, okay, how do I really increase the habitat value for native bees and things like that. Another thing you can sort of think about in terms of making use of a riparian area is wind speed reduction. So like this is a picture from the federal government's shelter belts booklet. And I mean, yeah, these numbers are tried and true. They've been around for a long time. Basically, shelter belts have a long history of increasing snow on the landscape, which aids in spring moisture, helping crops to get that early spring moisture. It can reduce your heating costs in the winter by 25%. And in general, across many studies over the decades, it increases the productivity of sheltered livestock and crops. So what I'm just talking about here is using those same sort of concepts to work with, like basically using the riparian areas and planting along them and thinking of them as potential for establishing sheltering cover that could be used for livestock and or crops or whatever else you might have down it. So this is the riparian areas are places where trees grow really well in many parts of Alberta and many parts of the world, better than other places on the landscape. And it may be hard to crop into them in the same way as you might otherwise or build into them, but you can get the sheltering benefit from them. So here we get into fruit or nut production. There's many different species. I'm just showing the native ones here, but there's many other ones as well. Riparian areas can be potentially good places to grow some of these species where things like annual crops might be harder. And in general, most of these species don't do great with getting flooded out. They like to have their feet dry. So I wouldn't recommend them on the edge of the water or anything like that. But up kind of on the edge of the upper edge of the riparian area or just above it, where they're not getting flooded, that can be a place where maybe it's still a bit too challenging topography for other forms of crops, but there's still plentiful moisture. Maybe there's shelter from other surrounding trees and shrubs, and they can really take off. So there's a variety of different species that you could plant there. These are just ones that are native to Alberta. Things to watch out for in riparian areas, though, avoiding planting in around floods and also where the frost pockets. So basically at the bottom of valleys or something, because they like to be kind of have a chance for the frost to drain in ways in areas that they're not. We're talking about fruits here, but fruits are not the only sort of edible things you can get from plants. Other foods or medicinal plants are also potential as well. We heard from Nola from Ontario last class, who has 9 acres of sugar maple, not too far from our riparian area, and I'm pretty envious of that. But I'm happy to say that in Alberta here, we do have our Manitoba maples. Particularly, they're native to the eastern part of the province, the far eastern. But they're over the last few years, I've been tapping them, and they make an absolutely wonderful syrup that would be boiled down just like sugar maples. And in many parts of the province, they really grow like weeds. They do really well. So I've been tapping Manitoba maples, and there's also, you can do the same thing with white birch as well, and make syrup out of that. So those are examples of other products. Other sort of plants that grow like quote unquote weeds in and around riparian areas, cattails, so eating the young shoots. I mean, there's many different parts of cattails that you can eat, and they have they're very, very productive. And then stinging nettle as well for when they're young for use in soups and teas, and I guess just you stir fry them as well. So I recently talked to a farmer northwest of Edmonton here, and they were worried because they had been grazing their horses in their forest for a long time, and they had basically overgrazed it a bit and were left with 80 acres of straight stinging nettle in their forest, which I mean is pretty worrying for hanging out in it. But I mean, in terms of having an incredible crop, it's valuable. And these guys, they like to be in quite moist areas, so good around riparian areas. Okay, so moving away from things that you can eat directly, talking about nutrient cycling here. So as I kind of mentioned before, and you see this graphic on the left-hand side, 75% of water in this study actually flows uphill and is used by the plants in the surrounding lands. And so that water can hold and transport nutrients along with it through the soil. And so the phrase like poop runs downhill is true some of the time, but sometimes it actually goes the opposite way. Poop can go uphill, or the parts of poop, I guess, the nutrients in poop. And so yeah, thinking about this and making use of this value by planting maybe crops nearby or something like that could be really effective. Or you can enhance your nitrogen, particularly out of nutrients, if you want to have additional nitrogen by planting nitrogen fixing species. And these shrubs here are examples of native nitrogen fixing species that basically form associations with bacteria in the soil that allow them to take N2 gas out of the atmosphere and make it into plant available nitrogen. There's been studies to show that plant available nitrogen can travel, this is not even in riparian, it's just in upland, can travel 60 feet in the soil. And this particular study was supplying 18% of the nitrogen needs of oats, growing 60 feet away from it, from shrubs like these. So yeah, really valuable to make use of nitrogen fixing species as well. Of course, then you can assist this process of nutrient cycling. So yes, nutrients do flow uphill, but I mean, if you want to enhance that, an option is to basically take plants that are really good at accumulating nutrients from lowlands and bring them back up to your uplands and kind of complete the cycle, maybe quicker or more effectively than it would go otherwise. Plants that have been used to do that in the past are things like duckweed, which is a native species that grows, it's like teeny little almost leaves that grows and doubles every 24 hours in warm, small wetlands. And it contains more, I can't remember the percentage, it's in the 30% protein, more than soybeans. It has an incredible amount of nitrogen in it, and it can be used as a mulch for upland plants and gardens. Cattails is another one as well that in the University of Manitoba is working with some other agencies that are experimenting with harvesting the cattails growing around the floodplains of Lake Winnipeg and using them as a fertilizer for upland areas. These are just two examples. I mean, thinking about what's growing well in your particular context and could be used for this purpose. Another option to think about would be timber and biomass production. So in this same study that they were talking about using cattails around Lake Winnipeg, what they actually did is they used cattails for nutrients, but also first they turned it into biomass, or in the main part of the experiment, they turned it into biomass. They turned it into pellets, and they burned them to create heat and as a source of energy. And then the ash was what where the nutrients was, like things like potassium were really high in the ash there. Riparians are really good at growing things fast and can be yeah, great products like cattails can come out of them. Willows have also been used in a similar way. There are several experiments happening around Alberta, one just north of Calgary and one at the Camrose County office, where they're growing willows that are actually used in treatment ponds for wastewater, and they're growing willows at a phenomenal rate. But you can do this on a sort of your own riparian area scale, and be harvesting willows and use that as a source of biomass or craft materials for various willow, for example, basket weaving and things like that. Of course, yeah, thinking about the scale you see in the picture in the middle there, it's interesting. It's getting into quite a single stand monoculture of willows. And I mean, yeah, it's about finding that balance between your scale that's appropriate and potentially making sure the riparian area functions well into the long term. And then there's your standard timber harvesting on the right-hand side here. So selectively harvesting perhaps timber around here. And as this sort of text here shows, not really appropriate for in the annual flood zone of a permanent water body. So in the main part of the riparian area of permanent water bodies, or on steep slopes where it could cause erosion, especially these machinery, when you bring machinery in like that. So then forage and browse production. So thinking about if you're wanting to bring animals into the riparian area, riparian areas, just like they're magnets for wildlife, they're magnets for livestock as well. They have water, shelter, and high forage productivity. So they're basically oases for livestock, which can be a challenge because it makes them really attractive and easily overused. Something to keep in mind, and I'm not going to go too much into this right now because Noreen will next class. She'll talk bring up grazing a fair bit more, but just to highlight that this is something that is that riparian areas are well known for. And then there's slightly less known riparian forage systems that I want to highlight just to put these ideas out there. And I'm bringing up one of my good friends, Dakota Cohen, who is really innovating with a whole bunch of different systems on his farm. And ones that are particularly of interest here today are his systems where he's the two crops that are good for nutrient cycling as mulch and stuff like that. I was mentioning cattails and duckweed can also be used as forage crops. In this case, for pigs and chickens as well. Particularly chickens like the duckweed. And here he has a system of harvesting the duckweed. This is a farmer, by the way, in Camrose County in central Alberta here. He harvests the duckweed and then he gathers it in a bucket. And he used to have to mix it with a bit of grain to get the pigs to go for it. But this year the pigs are all over it, just straight duckweed. They go for it, and he's supplementing and having to reduce his grain needs for his pigs quite a bit by doing that. And then a later part of the year, when his wetlands dry up a bit, he runs his pigs through them, and the pigs root around for the cattail roots, and they dig them up like crazy, and they're a really good source of carbohydrates for them. And so yeah, this is a really interesting system, and I want to emphasize that this is kind of exciting, and it's neat what he's doing. I also want to give the caveat though, like he's operating on a pretty small scale right now, just 30 pigs he's got, and he does conduct regular, albeit informal, but regular biological monitoring. So he's looking. He's got things that measure the quality of the water in his wetlands. He monitors basically the cattails to make sure that they are coming back each year, and they do every year. They come back and refill everything from where his pigs have grazed. And so I think these are exciting practices, but at this stage, we would recommend, I wouldn't just go out and start doing this on quarter sections, small scale trials in appropriate context, if this is appropriate for you, with more research and monitoring as we go. So these sorts of things are happening, and I really like how Dakota is thinking here and finding different ways of getting value out of his riparian areas. But it's definitely something that I think deserves more trials before scaling up full. But really exciting stuff. And you can watch. I took these screenshots of his YouTube videos. You can watch that video on the link provided below. And then we could talk about tourism and recreation as well. So yeah, thinking about whether this is something you want to do for money or for just for your own leisure. On the left there's another one of my friends, Don Rizika. He had a cabin on his land and he would have hunters and other folks come out and just enjoy the space, and that was a sort of an alternative source of income for him. So yeah, and thinking about how to design that in ways that those trails are not harming the riparian area, the low impact trails, going through spaces that aren't very sensitive. So I just want to highlight that this is another thing that we can talk about, and particularly Noreen might talk about a bit next class as well if there's interest. Okay, so I've gone through all these sort of examples here, and I've just listed them out. These are all the things I've talked about here, and this is not all of them. These are just some things that one could talk about with riparian areas. The possibilities are quite endless. I want to bring you back to page 7 there, and I want you to please put a star beside any needs that you think could be met by your riparian area, or other activities that are happening in it now that you've kind of learned about kind of what's possible in riparian areas. So yeah, put a star beside any needs that you think your riparian area could meet, and then list any additional activities that you've had ideas for, I guess, while listening to this, or any other activities. So I'm going to give, so I'll leave it on this screen for a few seconds just so you can memorize these two questions here. And then I'll put it back to the screen that shows the different goods and services I talked about. So start beside any needs that you think are relevant here or can be met, and any additional activities. you have ideas for. Okay, I'm going to go back to this just so you can remember some of the goods and services I was talking about. And I'm going to also put back on the chat here. Or I can see the screens now and stuff. So if anybody has any questions, I'll be able to see it.